Gospel this morning is from John chapter 12, verses 23 through 24, verse 27, and verses 31 through 32 of the New Revised Standard Version. Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Now my soul is troubled, and what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people, all things to myself."
Thank you, Jim. Do you ever notice, have you ever heard, do you experience that there are plenty of folks out there who say that we religious types are hopelessly naive and idealistic? Have you heard this from someone who is less naive than yourself, perhaps? I've had people say, "So, do you really believe that God even gives a damn?" I'm like, I'm wearing this collar as a joke. No, yes. There are people out there, and maybe because I do wear this collar, but I don't believe it. I think this is an experience we share. There are people out there who believe that we are waiting for the afterlife to be our comfort. And they believe that we are passive in the face of wickedness and injustice. They suggest that we're not in touch with the real world the way they are. We dream about the way it can be instead of recognizing the way it is. Have you ever heard any of these lines? Nod your head so that I don't feel alone. Exactly. But I see it this way. Like the prophets of old, we are just not willing to settle for less than the best of futures. Like the great prophet Jeremiah that you shared in the call to worship this morning. We're determined to learn how to be fully alive human beings, not just in our heads, not just in books, not just in the courts of law, but deep inside ourselves. At an instinctive level, we want to be able to do right and love God and love our neighbor. And we want to be able to work for peace that thrives with justice and joy. Every community organizer in this country, and a lot of them are people of many faiths, every single one of them knows this mantra: we are determined to work for the world as it can be, and we will not settle for the broken and suffering world that is right now. This is the mantra. This is the calling card. This is the rallying cry of the Spokane Alliance right here in Spokane, of your very own WestCat team. We will not settle. If people think of all of us inside the Spokane Alliance, and that would be people united as Christians and Jews, as Unitarians and as atheists, as iron workers and as laborers and nurses and janitors and teachers and musicians, if they think all of us are naive, then I say, so be it, and count me in with them. Count me in with the prophets of old like Jeremiah and the new prophets who were out there yesterday at that vigil. Count me in with the people who will not settle for the destruction and the hate and the violence and the despair that seem to cover our globe like a suffocating blanket. Count me in with the workers in the NAACP and the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Count me in with the tribes that are fighting for the river. Count me in with the Latinx community fighting for immigrant rights. Count me in with all the old radicals and the new young organizers and the protesters from yesterday and the creators of the art for Black Lives Matter downtown. Count me in because I hear the prophet. And the prophet says that we are in the best of company. We are actually in God's own company, full of heart and passion and hope and joy. And I believe you can then count me in as a Jesus person. Jesus says in the text that Jim just shared with you today that he will not ask to be spared from hardship and suffering and even death, because it is for the elimination of those very evils that he has come. He says, now the ruler of this world, which is another way of saying, now the evil that thrives in this world, now he says, that ruler will be driven out. That evil is driven out. As one who is in perfect communion with God, Jesus shows the world in the way he lives, the way he dies, and the way he rises once again. He shows the world God's heart, God's everlasting love, God's design for all creation. Did you hear as Jim read the text, he says, at the end, Jesus says, I will draw all people to myself. In fact, in the Greek, I will draw all creation, all things to myself. All things, all of us, all of creation, drawn closer in to God in Jesus. Friends, in the Gospels, Jesus is always trying to get us back into communication, into communion with God. We, Jesus sees, have been estranged so long, have been stuck with misunderstanding and miscommunication between ourselves and our God for so long that, as Jeremiah puts it, it had to be expounded as law. It had to be written into books. It had to be pounded into our thick skulls. And yet, the intention of Jesus and the intention of God is to find a different way, a different possibility. And there is therefore the vision, the dream of humanity, which envisions God's heart within us. Not as something to be learned, but something to be known as intimately as our own heartbeat. To be as natural to us as our own breathing. And when we understand God's heart, remember lest we misunderstand God's heart. Remember what the prophet Jeremiah said. God's heart is a heart filled with everlasting love. That said, it's not easy to be filled with that kind of love, to love as God's heart loves. Jesus recognizes that he will be killed for modeling that exact truth, that exact greatness of heart that is God's greatness of heart. You and I are witness to thousands of years of people who have already been themselves the rulers of this world. They practice a selfish sort of realism, as they would put it, in which the many suffer and die so that the few might revel in luxury and ease, and they pass off their cruelty by saying, that's just the way it is. Well, for equally thousands of years, we have seen Jesus followers and God lovers showing us another way of looking at the world. Living lives in service to the poor and the forgotten, in laboring for the sick and the dying, and yes, indeed, in laboring to change the very tides of civilization, moving us all towards justice and mercy and compassion and joy, peace and safety. I know. We're just learning how to do this. Each of us in our homes, in our lives, uniquely trying to figure it out, learning how to do it. And I know that learning this way of love, this God in your heart, not just God in your head or a law book, I know that this entails struggle and sacrifice. Jesus is our witness to this. So are many, countless of the beloved dead, whom we sometimes call the saints, who have given their very lives to make this truth of the prophet, this truth of Jesus, real in the world. Sure, we all know about Dr. King. And don't forget Medgar Evers. Don't forget Malcolm X. Don't forget Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Don't forget Edith Stein, who grew up in a Jewish family, converted to Roman Catholicism, and then was murdered in Auschwitz as a nun of Jewish descent. We are all striving as best we can in our own ways, like Jesus, to drive out the ruler of the world, the evil that thrives in the world. I believe all of you are striving in big ways and small ways, day by day, to make this world what Jesus would call the kingdom of God. And we do this for Francis and Tavita and their little brother Daniel. We do this for Jasmine and for Alisher. We do this, the making of the kingdom of God in the world, with the love of God deep within the hearts of every person. We do this for the twin grandchildren of Roger and Linda, children whose father comes from Somalia, Francis and Tavita and Daniel, whose daddy comes from Tonga, Jasmine and Alisher, who are Asian. We do this so our children may know safety and joy. All of our children. I want this for Savaya and Christian and Addie, my grandchildren. I want this for Anna in Montana. I want it for Annie and Sam, and I know you do too. I know you want it for Lydia and for Naomi and Josh, for Pax, for Alex and Ethan, for children whose names we don't know, for little baby Ara, who was just born a week and a half ago. This is what we want. When we say, with Jesus, we want to drive the ruler of the world out. We want to fight for the world where all the children are safe and welcomed, whether they are straight or gay or trans, whether they are handicapped or not. For the children that are female and for the children that are male, for those that are across the ocean, starving in Syria, or the children across the street who don't have enough to eat. So, am I naive? Are you too idealistic? You and I, like Jesus, we are fighting for the world as it can be. Jesus shows us the way for us. And he is asking us to take the risk to follow. He is leading us into the promise of living in God's heart living in us. And I say that he is asking us to go out and share the promise of God's heart in each of us and God's kingdom in our world at last. We're going to sing Walton Delia.